If you have residential property that you lease out, like a house or apartment building or something like that, what method do you use first to analyze the financial condition of a tenant, whether they can afford the rent? Do you have something like that? I'm going to share the 2 rules of thumb that I use for everything, the first step I take that really helps out and will save you tons of time and also reduce the risk of later on of a default. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Real Estate Minute Show. Talking about tenants today and analyzing a tenant lease. Now, in another episode, we're going to get into the minutia of looking at credit reports, credit scores, tax returns, all that kind of stuff, and looking at the total cost that a tenant incurs on a monthly basis and how to analyze that. But what I use, especially when it's a hot market like right now, when the leases are just, there's so few available, you have to compete to get a lease heavily to compete. Like you get 10 applications for one apartment. How do you just kind of thin the field right away on the financial side of it? So you look at the financial side first before you get into anything else. Can they afford this rent? Okay, based upon what they've showed you, which is usually pay stubs or a tax return, can they afford this rent? Do they make enough money? That's the easiest and quickest way. And you should do that anyway. If you're not doing that and you're just looking at pay stubs and saying, it just kind of feels right, you're going to end up in unlawful detainer court for 6 months and you're never going to collect rent and have about $20,000 in legal fees. Okay. So before you analyze everything else, this is what I do. And these are 2 rules of thumb that I use, and they're very kind of well known in the industry. You may fluctuate with them, use them heavier or not, and the weight on them, but I use them pretty heavy weight at the very beginning. And here's the 2 factors I use. One is, I take the monthly rent of the unit I'm trying to lease. I multiply it times 40. That is the amount of money that tenant has to make a year. I take the factor, and I'm not going to get into what 40 is. We could talk about that in the future, but it's a factor times the monthly rent, and that will tell you how much that tenant has to make in gross income, okay, not net after taxes, gross income every year. That's the first. The second one will show you how much rent this tenant can afford. The first one we just did, 40 times monthly rent, will show you the gross income required from that tenant on an annual basis. The second factor I use is going to tell you how much monthly rent they can afford. So that factor is 30% times their monthly gross income. Okay, 30% times their monthly gross income. So those are the 2 factors I use. And here's an example to make it simple. Let's say we have an apartment that we're leasing for $3,000 a month. Okay, and this tenant particularly that came forward here makes $80,000 gross income. They showed you pay stubs and such, okay, and verified it. So $3,000 a month of rent, $80,000 a month of annual gross income. So the first factor, the first formula is 40 times the monthly rent. So 40 times 3,000 is $120,000 a year. Okay, so that tenant needs to make $120,000 a year to afford that rent. Okay, this tenant makes 80. They failed on the first one right away. Well, let's continue anyway to the second one. The second one is 30% times the monthly gross income from that tenant that they make in their salary. So they make $80,000 a year. Divide that by 12, and you come up with about $6,700 a month gross income. Multiply that times 30%. Okay, and that will tell you how much rent that tenant can afford to pay, which is $2,000 a month. They failed there too because we're trying to lease it for $3,000. So right away, that tenant financially does not satisfy the financial requirements. Right away, move them to the side, go on to the next. So this is an easy way to kind of get through tenants and applications when you have multiple applications, especially in today's market when you might have, we had a unit, we had 12 applications on one unit. What do we do with all this? They all have their own variables and stories, right? In financial, they make different amounts. This is an easy way to kind of thin the field right off the bat based on financial condition. Have a great week. Hope this was helpful. Hope it saves you time and money and default risk later on. And I want you to have a great week, and we'll see you next week on the Real Estate Minute Show.